Welcome this morning to our Spring 2022 Grace A. Tanner Lecture in Human Values. I'm Dr. Danielle Dabrowski, Director of the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values at Southern Utah University and Professor of Creative Writing. This year, as many of you may know, we are celebrating a year of grace, a year-long commemoration of 40 years of the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values on the campus of Southern Utah University. Thus, the Tanner Center has hosted 2 lectures this year, and we are pleased to present journalist and a philosopher and psychologist Emily Esfahani Smith to give the Spring 2022 Grace A. Tanner Lecture in Human Values. Over the past few years, the Tanner Center has explored a different theme. This year, we created a theme based on the concept from Emily Smith's book, The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness, and this is available after the lecture out at the book table. The concept that we chose is building cultures of meaning. This book was written prior to the pandemic, yet there was a foreshadowing in Smith's book that indicates she was aware of how people were searching for meaning in the midst of what at that time were our hectic lives, if you can recall back to that time. And she quotes on page 192, I quote, "All across the country, medical professionals, business leaders, educators, clergymen, and ordinary people are using the pillars of meaning to transform the institutions in which we live and work, creating communities that value and build connections, celebrate purpose, provide opportunities for storytelling, and leave space for mystery. Their efforts are part of a larger shift in our society toward meaning." This sentence conveys a sense of belonging, the sharing of stories, and the creation of connections between cultures. Each of these ideas exemplify what I understand about Grace A. Tanner's legacy. It is the reason we have invited Emily Esfahani Smith to give a Tanner Lecture during the Year of Grace. For a bit of background about the Tanner Center, the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values was created through an endowment provided by the Tanner Trust for the Utah Universities by Obert C. Tanner, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Utah, and the founder and former chairman of the O.C. Tanner Jewelry Company. The purpose of the trust was to provide a lecture series at 3 Utah universities to which the Tanner family had close ties: the University of Utah, Utah State University, and Southern Utah University, then Southern Utah State College, where Grace Adams Tanner, Obert's beloved wife, had attended school. At Southern Utah University, the Tanner Lecture was established as a function of the Grace A. Tanner Center, and you can read more about the lecture and the history of the Grace A. Tanner Center on our website. But to quote Professor Tanner, O.C. Tanner, "I see the lecture simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. And to this end, the lecture provides a forum in which to promote scholarly and scientific learning in the field of human values, while embracing moral, aesthetic, intellectual, and spiritual values, both individual and social, and advancing the full register of values pertinent to the human condition, interest, behavior, and aspiration." For the introduction for Emily Esfahani Smith, she is a writer in Washington, D.C., who draws on psychology, philosophy, and literature to write about the human experience, why we are the way we are, and how we can find grace and meaning in a world that is full of suffering. And again, the author of The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. The former managing editor of the New Criterion, Smith's articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and other publications. In 2019, she was a Poynter Journalism Fellow at Yale University. Smith is also a reporter for the Aspen Institute's Weave Project, an initiative founded by New York Times' David Brooks to address the problems of isolation, alienation, and division, which are such prominent topics right now. At Weave, Smith finds and tells the stories of people who are working to rebuild the social fabric. Following Emily Smith's lecture, there will be a moderated discussion with Dr. Lynn White, Professor of Psychology here at SUU, and at the close of this event, we invite you to join us for a reception and book signing in the lobby. At 2:30, we will have a special Q&A with Emily Smith back here in the Great Hall. And we had a wonderful conversation with her last night about, again, these unique times that we live in. And so so looking forward to having her here on campus after many trying to have her here despite the pandemic. And so please welcome Emily Esfahani Smith.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. As Danielle was alluding to, I was originally supposed to come out here in 2020, and then the pandemic happened. So for the last 2 years, I've been kind of anticipating this moment. So thank you all for being here. I know that you are all very busy, and so I'm grateful that you're here to spend this hour with me. Thank you to Danielle and the Grace Tanner Institute for having me here, and to the SUU community in general. It's such an honor to be part of this celebration of Grace Tanner's life. She sounds, I had a chance to learn a little bit about her last night, and she just sounds like a remarkable woman. So I'm honored to be here. So I am here to talk about meaning today, and in particular, how we can find meaning during hard times, and how meaning can help us persist through difficult times, which we've all been going through since 2020. And to set the stage, I thought I would talk about the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankel, because it was his work that really kind of opened up the topic of meaning to me when I was studying positive psychology in graduate school several years ago. So Frankel was a Holocaust survivor, and he was a psychiatrist living in Vienna when the Nazis came to power. In 1942, he and his wife, who was pregnant at the time, and his parents were transported to a Nazi concentration camp. And 3 years later, when the war was over and the camps were liberated, his wife had died, his parents had died, most of his friends and relatives had perished, but he survived. And within a year of being released, he wrote this beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. And the book is all about the importance of finding meaning in suffering, and it draws upon his experiences in the concentration camp. So Frankel talks about how the people in the camp had lost everything. They'd lost their homes, their freedom. Many had watched their loved ones, their children, disappear into the gas chambers. And so understandably, they concluded that there was nothing left to live for. They gave up on hope. And that was, obviously like a very understandable position to take given the horrendous circumstances they found themselves in. But there were others, Frankel found, who took a different perspective, who continued to believe their lives were meaningful, even in spite of the terrible circumstances they found themselves in. And these people, Frankel saw, were not only more resilient in the face of suffering, but they were even more apt to survive, he wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, in the face of the degradations that they were experiencing. And we know from more contemporary empirical research that there's something to what Frankel was anecdotally observing, that people who have a sense of meaning in life do experience greater longevity, they have stronger immune systems, so there's something that kind of enlivens the body, that protects you against not only emotional stressors, but physical stressors as well. And to illustrate the importance of meaning in the camps, Frankel tells the story of two suicidal inmates that he counseled there in his capacity informally as a psychiatrist there. And for both of these men, he said, restoring in them the will to live was a matter of getting them to see that there was still something expected of them in the future, a why to keep them moving ahead. For one man who was a scientist and a scholar, it was a series of books that he had began to write before the war, and which really only he could complete because of his unique expertise. So, remembering that project restored in him the will to live. And for another man, it was the prospect of reuniting with his young son, who was living in refuge elsewhere in Europe. Again, for both of these men, remembering the why of their existence, Frankel writes, quoting the philosopher Nietzsche, help them withstand any how. So this idea that when you have meaning, you can withstand whatever it is that life throws your way. Frankel's signature contribution to the field of psychology and psychiatry is something called logotherapy. Logos is the ancient Greek word for meaning, so meaning therapy. And the idea behind logotherapy is that human beings have a need for meaning that's as powerful and vital to our emotional and spiritual health as the need for food, water, and safety are to our physical well-being and survival. And that without meaning, we suffer in really profound ways. When I first encountered these ideas in graduate school, they really moved me, and I think in part it had to do with certain experiences that I had in my childhood, which I'll just speak briefly about because it also, both learning about Frankel's work and these experiences are ultimately what led me to writing more deeply about meaning in my book and elsewhere. So growing up, I live in Washington, D.C. now, as Danielle mentioned, but I grew up in Montreal, downtown Montreal, where my parents ran a meditation center from our home. And they were Sufi. So for those who might not know, Sufism is a spiritual and mystical practice that's associated with Islam. And so living in this Sufi meeting house, in this meditation center, I was surrounded by spiritual seekers. Twice a week on Thursdays and Sunday nights, these spiritual seekers would come to our home and they would sit on the floor in this large room and they would meditate for several hours while Persian Sufi music played in the background. So meditation was an important part of their spiritual practice, meditation and prayer. But so was being involved in the community and doing acts of service. I can recall, homeless people kind of coming and going from the meditation center when I was a child. And, loving kindness, a principle of all the great religious and spiritual traditions, was also at the center of their spiritual practice. And so, growing up, I was surrounded by people who had a pretty clear sense of what it meant to lead a meaningful life and what the meaning of life was. So leading a meaningful life, lay in doing things like meditating and praying and fasting. And the purpose of that was to kind of turn the volume down on the ego to connect to something much bigger, which they thought of as God. So that kind of, that stayed with me. And the other thing that stayed with me was that a lot of these people who were coming through our doors had led really hard lives. Some of them were refugees from the Middle East, where you can be persecuted for being a Sufi because it's considered heretical. Others were Westerners, Canadians, and Americans who had been beaten up by life in other ways. But all of them found comfort and peace in this spiritual practice that demanded a lot of them, but also gave them something back. Well, eventually we moved away from Montreal. We came to the U.S., where I've lived ever since. And throughout my teenage years and college years, without that grounding of a spiritual practice in my life, daily, I began to kind of wonder, well, what is it that makes life meaningful outside of a spiritual and religious context? Is there a way to find meaning in our increasingly secular world? And that question led me to studying philosophy when I was in college, and later positive psychology in graduate school, which is this branch of psychology that empirically studies well-being. So happiness, meaning, how to have positive, healthy relationships, all those things that make life worth living. And as I was studying those topics, I came upon some research that really surprised me. And just as background, one of the hallmarks of our culture, of Western culture in general, but certainly of American culture, is this kind of preoccupation with happiness. We're told all the time that a good life is a happy life, and that if we pursue happiness, we'll be more successful and have more friends and even make more money, all these benefits that will come to us if only we were happy all the time. And it turns out that a lot of people, as a result, highly value happiness and desire to be happy because of this cultural messaging. But what the research finds is that when people value happiness in this way, when they consider it to be the be-all, end-all of life and kind of organize their lives around the pursuit of it, they actually end up feeling unhappy and alone. So that was one piece of research that really surprised me. But then this other piece of research surprised me even more. And it was this: if you take the long view of history, over the centuries, millennia, even decades, even, it's never been a better time to be alive. I know it doesn't always feel that way, but if you kind of take a larger perspective, people today are far less likely to die from violent death than they were decades and centuries ago. More people live in societies where they enjoy basic freedoms and dignity. Every year, millions of people are lifted out of poverty. You're far less likely to die from disease and medical issues as well. People are living longer than ever. In all of these ways, by these objective standards, life has gotten better. And yet, at the same time, more people feel hopeless, depressed, and alone. The suicide rate has been rising all around the world in recent years, and in the US, it reached a 30-year high not too long ago. And all of those trends, rising rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, suicide, self-harm, they've only intensified over the last few years during COVID. And in particular, we're seeing them intensify on college campuses, which is really heartbreaking. And when the researchers crunched the numbers to try to understand what's going on, what's driving this rising tide of despair, what they find is that it's not being driven by a lack of happiness in people's lives, but by a lack of meaning. And I think that that's a little bit counterintuitive, or at least it was to me when I first came across it. Because when someone is feeling bad, or when you yourself are feeling bad, it makes sense that you would want to feel good, to do things to make you happier. And so that's what a lot of people do. But happiness doesn't penetrate us as deeply, doesn't get into the core of the issue the way that meaning does. And I've been using these two terms. Let me take a second to define them. So happiness, the way it's defined in the culture, the way most people think about it, the way it's measured in the research, is a positive mental and emotional state. If you feel good, you're happy, and if you feel bad, you're unhappy. And it comes and goes. You could be happy one moment and then get a phone call with some bad news, and that happiness disappears. Meaning, though, is bigger. So the defining feature of leading a meaningful life is connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, whether that's your community, the work that you do, nature, if you are religious and spiritual, God, or a sense of the divine or transcendent, the sacred. And when people tell researchers that their lives are meaningful in empirical work, it's usually because three conditions have been satisfied. The first is that they believe their lives have a sense of significance and worth. The second is they believe their lives are driven by a sense of purpose, so that why that Frankel writes about. And then finally, they believe their lives are coherent. So they don't kind of look back at their experiences, at the world in general, and see a random jumble of chaotic stimuli, but things come together into a larger whole. And it turns out that over the last decade or two, psychologists have really turned their attention to studying meaning and what happens when people orient themselves to the search and pursuit of meaning as opposed to the search and pursuit of happiness, and what happens. And when they do, when their lives are oriented towards meaning, they, if they're students, they do better in school. If they're professionals, they're more engaged with their work and more productive. They are more resilient, as Frankel found, in the face of suffering. As I mentioned earlier, they have greater physical health and live longer. And as they come to the end of their lives and are facing death, they're far more likely to feel at peace with the fact that they'll die instead of feeling terrified by that prospect. So something special about meaning that brings those benefits. Well, all of this made me wonder as I was kind of pouring through the research, well, okay, if meaning is so important, then what do we have to have in our lives in order for our lives to feel meaningful? Is it something is this kind of a pursuit that each of us has to do on our own, or are there some principles that we can all rely upon? And to answer this question, I poured through the research, read through literally thousands of pages of psychology and philosophy, literature, anything I could get my hands on that spoke to this question. But I also interviewed many people about their own life stories, ordinary people or extraordinary people, people from all branches of life, from around the country, even around the world, about what their sources of meaning are. And as I brought these stories together, looked through the data, I started to notice certain themes and patterns come up again and again in the stories people told me and in the research. And there were 4 in particular that I was able to identify. So I'll tell you what they are now, and I call these the 4 pillars of meaning. I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll spend the rest of the talk kind of walking through each one. So there's the first one, which is having a sense of belonging, those relationships that are important to us. The second is purpose, which I've already briefly touched upon. The third is transcendence, or experiences of the sacred and awe and wonder. And finally, there's storytelling, so how we make sense of our lives and the world around us. So I'll start with belonging. Belonging is about the relationships that we have and the communities that we're a part of. And it's pretty known in the research within positive psychology, and it's probably pretty commonsensical that having relationships is really important to well-being. But belonging is really about a certain kind of relationship, one in which you are valued for who you are intrinsically, and where you value the other person for who they are intrinsically. And I think that's a really important qualification, because you can imagine being part of a relationship or in a community where you're valued for what you achieve, maybe how much money you make, in the case of certain gangs and cults, for who you hate, and not for who you are. So true belonging, I think, springs from a place of love. It can be, lowercase l love or capital L love, this kind of spirit of generosity towards the other. And it's a choice. We can choose to cultivate belonging with another person. It's not like our relationships just either have or don't have belonging. We can actively build it with another. Let me give you an example of this. So one of my friends, Jonathan, lives in New York City. And every morning he has this routine where he goes and he buys a newspaper from the same street vendor on the corner. And this is a big city. It's rush hour, especially as people are going back in person. It's becoming more like it was a couple years ago, where everyone is just busy. The streets are crammed. The subway is always frustratingly late. And so you can imagine that these 2 men have every incentive to rush through this exchange of goods for money. But that's not what they do. Every morning, they take a second to slow down, to talk to each other, to ask each other how they are, how their families are, and to basically treat each other like human beings. And over the years that they've been doing this, they've come to develop a friendship, and they've come to know about each other and their personal lives even a little bit. And they both leave that encounter feeling elevated, like they've been truly seen by the other person. Well, one time, not too long ago, Jonathan went to buy a newspaper, but he realized that he didn't have the right amount of change. And the vendor said, "You know what, this time don't worry about it. The paper is on me." But Jonathan didn't feel comfortable with that, so he went to a corner store and he bought a pack of gum or something he didn't need, in order to make change. And when he came back and gave the money to the vendor drew back. He was hurt. he had been trying to do something kind for Jonathan to build that pillar of belonging with him, but Jonathan had rejected that bid for affection. And I mention this twist to the story because I think all of us do things like this all the time without realizing it. I might be at home and my husband is telling me something that's important and I'm kind of on my phone or distracted. Or I might walk by someone I know in the hallway and be so in my own head that I barely acknowledge them. And we know from research that, when people are treated in that way, when they're made to feel like they're rejected or ignored or ostracized, even in small ways, they not only conclude that their own lives are less meaningful, but that life in general is less meaningful. So there's a really important connection between feeling like you matter to others and feeling like your life matters to you. So even though this pillar can kind of easily be broken, it can also easily be reconstructed. So the next time Jonathan saw the vendor, he brought him a cup of tea, and they continue to today share that little moment of belonging with each other because Jonathan was able to kind of make that attempt to repair the bond. So as easily as that pillar, we can, intentionally or unintentionally kind of knock that pillar down, we can also build it back up in the smallest of ways. I want to take a second to talk about a study about belonging on college campuses because I think, it's so relevant to where we are right now. A lot of students, I mentioned the mental health crisis on campuses before, and one of the things that's driving it is this sense of isolation that a lot of students feel, this sense of I don't belong, do I fit in here? Everyone seems like they have so many friends, look at all these posts on social media, I feel all by myself, my life doesn't feel like it's as glamorous as these other lives. And so what this study that I'm going to tell you about did was it showed college students, freshman college students who were white and African American, these two different groups, a video that explained to them that the transition to college is really hard for everyone, and that part of what makes that transition hard is finding your group and finding a group of friends that you feel comfortable with. And it's totally normal to not find that group right away and to at times feel a lack of sense of belonging. And that this is just a normal part of life, that sometimes you'll feel like you belong and sometimes you won't, whether you're in college, adult, whatever. And so they showed them this video and then they followed up with them a few months later, a few years later, and then a decade later. And what they found was that this intervention had a really profound effect, especially for the African American students who felt a greater threat to their belonging being on campus because of the prejudice that they encounter. And so groups that are many college students feel a lack of sense of belonging, but then there are certain college students who, by virtue of being part of a certain group, have their sense of belonging threatened even more. And so what this study shows is that for those groups, for African Americans in this case, that intervention was especially effective. So when they followed up with the African American students, a few months later, they found that their grades were higher than those in a control group. When they followed up with them a few years later at the end of college, they found that their grades continued to be higher and that they rated their college experience as more meaningful. When they followed up with them a decade later, they found that they felt more successful in their careers, had more satisfaction and meaning in their careers, and reported greater satisfaction in life in general. So there's something really powerful about that. And when the researchers tried to understand what was going on, like why did this intervention have these effects, what they found was that a lot of those students didn't even remember watching that video. But what happened was, as a result of feeling a greater sense of belonging because of having their difficult transition to college life normalized, they were more likely to reach out to professors and mentors and other people in their community over the course of their college career, and that helped them become more integrated into the community, and that had these long-lasting benefits. So I know cultures of meaning is something that we're here to discuss, and that's one way that we can all help to build a culture of meaning here on campus, is to normalize what it feels like to not feel belonging and to bring people into the community. So that's belonging. The second pillar is purpose. And purpose is this term that it gets interchanged, it gets used interchangeably with meaning often. And it's kind of this big word. I think a lot of people think that, they have to find their capital P purpose if they want to, have meaning in life, or a capital C calling in order for their lives to be meaningful. And that might be the case for some people, but it's not always the case, as I found in my research. Purpose, the way psychologists define it, is a goal or a principle that organizes your life and that involves making a contribution to others in some way. So, when I talk to people, many parents, for example, told me their purpose is raising their children. I spoke to a hospital cleaner who told me she was part of this bigger study of meaning at work, and she told me that her purpose is healing sick people. So, she's somebody who, spends the majority of her day, cleaning, mopping the floors, cleaning out bedpans, taking out trash from hospital rooms, and yet she was able to connect the tasks that she did to this higher meaning, and that gave her a sense of purpose. One of the most charming examples of purpose that I came across in my research comes from Japan, this community in Okinawa, Japan. And researchers identified this community as they were looking around the world, looking for places where there is a high concentration of centenarians. So of people who are living to the age of 100 and beyond, and living so kind of with vitality and health. And they want to understand, well, why are there these places where people are living so long and so well? And in Okinawa, what they found was that the active ingredient was purpose. And when they talked to the people there about their sense of purpose, what they found was that they found purpose in these really small ways. So one person talked about how his purpose was tending to his garden. Another person said that his purpose was playing his lute, a musical instrument for his community. Another was the town's priestess. It's the Shinto religion over there. Well, that's one of the religions over there. And so her purpose was kind of praying to the gods on behalf of her community members. Another talked about how going around and checking on her friends. They all are getting older, so checking on them and making sure they were okay was her purpose. So they had these kind of everyday sources of purpose that helped them get up out of bed in the morning and brought to them that sense of that why that Frankel was telling them, and that kind of energized their lives. And what we know from the research is that when people have that sense of purpose, that they can connect to something beyond themselves, they do not only kind of live longer, but they have this reason to get up in the morning that helps them persist through both the good and the bad. And there's a study that I really like that speaks to this point, that looks at college students and high school students, but I think its lessons are applicable to small children, but also to adults across the lifespan. So this study wanted to get these students to think about purpose in this way that I'm describing. So instead of thinking of purpose as something that you have to go out and turn over rocks and find, having a mindset of purpose, living with purpose. And the way that they instigated that mindset in these people was by having them think about how they wanted to make the world a better place. So they showed them this prompt that said, a lot of people in their careers want to make the world a better place in some way. How do you want to make the world a better place? And the students wrote about all kinds of things. So one student wrote about how she wants to go into law enforcement to bring a sense of safety to her community. Another student wrote about how he wants to become a genetic engineer to help produce more crops to address the issue of hunger around the world. These different nice examples. And what they found was that when students wrote about their purpose just for a few minutes, not only did they get better grades over the course of the semester, but when they were put in a situation in the lab setting where they could be distracted by a temptation, in this case video games that were on a computer over here, versus working through a problem set that the researchers gave them, they were much more likely to persist in the problem set that was difficult and tedious, even though the researchers said, you can put it away and go look at this, go play these games at any point that you want. So they had the freedom to choose, and they chose to do the hard thing when they were primed with purpose. So purpose is something that gives us motivation to get through the hard things that we all face every day in life. So purpose, belonging and purpose. The third pillar is transcendence, and I'm so happy to be here and talk about this pillar because there's transcendence all around us in Cedar City. You just have to look out the window and see the mountains and have your breath taken away. So transcendence, it's a big word. What am I talking about here? Transcendent moments are those moments when you're lifted above the hustle and bustle of daily life, where you can step outside of your own head and connect to something awe-inspiring and much bigger than yourself. It could be nature, like I imagine many of you do connect with around here out in the mountains. It could be God, a sense of the sacred. It could be music or moving communally in a group. There are all kinds of ways that we lose our sense of self a little bit to feel this sense of awe and wonder and connectedness with the world around us that brings us a sense of meaning in life. And what's really interesting about transcendent experiences is that people who've had them rate them as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives, even if they are kind of small transcendent experiences, because these experiences exist on a spectrum. You can go out and, like the American transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, you can go out in the woods and feel your sense of self dissolve. Emerson talks about how in the woods he felt like a transparent eyeball, like the boundary between who he was and the outside world dissolved a little bit, and he felt a sense of oneness. Or you can have a major transcendent experience where your whole sense of self completely melts away and you feel a sense of oneness, oceanic oneness, people say, with the world around you. Regardless of whether it's a major transcendent experience or a more everyday one, there is the sense of meaning that comes because when people come back from the transcendent experience, they report having a deeper perspective on their lives and a shift in their values. So instead of focusing so much on themselves and their own kind of self-involved interests, they're a little bit more focused, have an other-oriented and a world-oriented focus. So there's a study that speaks to this that was conducted out on the campus of Berkeley University, where the researchers had students go out and look at this towering grove of eucalyptus trees that were 200 feet tall. So they're looking up at the trees. You can imagine out here, looking at the mountains. So they were looking up at the trees for just 1 minute. And they felt this sense of awe and wonder. They had a transcendent experience, the researchers determined when they talked to them about it later. And that transcendent experience did kind of boost their sense of meaning, but not only did it do that, it also shifted their mindset a little bit so that later on in the experiment, when they were put in a position to help somebody, they were far more likely to help that person and to spend a longer amount of their time helping that person. So these experiences don't just make our own lives feel more meaningful, but they kind of shift our behaviors to get us to act in ways that support a meaningful life. We hear a lot about mindfulness these days, and it's become, almost like purpose. It's become this buzzword that can lose its sense of meaning because we hear it so much. But it actually is a really powerful portal to transcendence, one that I really like to talk about because it's one that we can all access no matter where we are or who we're with. And the example that I like to talk about is this poem by the 20th century American poet Anthony Hecht. And the poem is called Venetian Vespers. And in the poem, the speaker in the poem is in Venice. And, he's a tourist in Venice, and he's excited, like, a tourist would be, to go out and see all the sights. There are a lot of beautiful things, historical things to see. But there's a rainstorm, and he's stuck inside of his hotel. And so, somebody might be, a lot of people might be disappointed, given that. But that's not what happens with the speaker. He, looks outside and he actually sees that there is this extraordinarily beautiful scene unfolding before him. So I'm looking down so I can actually read to you from the poem. So he describes this rainstorm at length. He observes and gives words to every single detail that he experiences. So the clouds are not just these gray things in the sky, but they are shrouded vaults, he writes, fog-bound crevices. He listens to the rain and he hears a whisper of dry leaves. He watches it, and what he sees is that it stains the paving stones, forms a light mist of brilliant crystals dulled with tones of lead 3 inches off the ground. These exquisite details. Then later he writes, to give one's whole attention to such a sight is a sort of blessedness. One escapes from all the anguish of this world into the refuge of the present tense. So I love that. And I love, I know Danielle, you're a professor of poetry, and I love bringing poetry in because poetry is such a beautiful portal to transcendence, one way to slow us down. So if you haven't read a poem lately, I encourage you to do so. So that's transcendence, belonging, purpose, and transcendence. The final pillar is storytelling. And storytelling, I found as I've talked about these pillars of meaning, can sometimes be the one that surprises people the most. And I think the reason for that is that we don't always realize that we are all storytellers of our own lives and that we have an ongoing narrative about ourselves, about the world we live in, moving through our minds all the time. And what this means is that if we're telling a story that's holding us back in some way, which a lot of people do, we can change that story. We can edit it and retell it and interpret it in new ways, all the while respecting the facts. So let me give an example of this. So one of the areas of psychology that deals with storytelling is called narrative psychology, narrative therapy. And people who go, one of the things that happens in therapy is that the therapist helps you retell your story in a more healthy way. So that's kind of one way to think about what therapy is. And so narrative therapists give this example. They say, okay, imagine that you have woken up, imagine that you, you have an important job interview on, a particular day. And you wake up and you realize that you slept through your alarm. So that's one data point that you're working with. You slept in late. And so you get up and you realize that you're going to be late to this job interview and you're rushing around and you can't find your car keys. They're not in the usual place. So there's a second data point. And then, finally you find the keys, you make your way out the door and you get into the car and the gas tank is empty. So there's a third data point. And you start to look at those facts and you start to string them together, connect the dots, and tell a story about the kind of person you are. I'm someone who doesn't have my act together. I am always late. That's why I lost my last job. That's why things don't work out for me. That's why I don't really have as many friends as I want. And it can quickly spiral downwards. Well, a narrative therapist would say, what about all these other dots that you didn't incorporate into the story, these other data points? What about the fact that you woke up late because you were at the hospital the night before, late into the night, checking on your grandmother? What about the fact that your keys weren't where you left them because you threw them in your gym bag because you're trying to, have a healthier lifestyle? What about the fact that, okay, maybe you are late, but the person who's interviewing you might understand. So there's no need to immediately jump to the negative conclusion. Once you start incorporating all these other data points into the story, that narrative starts to shift and you begin to tell a different story about yourself. And, I get asked sometimes, when I'm giving that example, well, isn't that just Pollyanna-ish thinking? Aren't you just kind of glossing over the negative? And the answer is no, actually, because we know from decades of research in psychology that human beings have a really powerful negativity bias. So when something bad happens, it's much more likely to implant itself in your brain, to affect you physiologically, than when something good happens. And this is so profound that in relationships, for example, if you want to have a happy, healthy relationship, you have to have 5 good things happen for every one bad thing that happens, because the bad so poisons the well. And what this means in our lives is that when bad things happen, we're much more likely to remember them and to incorporate them into our stories and discount the positive than when good things happen. So it's not unrealistic. It's not Pollyanna-ish to sit back and think about, wait a second, what are the positive things that I'm not accounting for in this story? Once you do that, actually, you're probably telling a story that's more real than the story that you're telling that has that negative bent to it. So that's kind of an example of storytelling, in the day-to-day. There's also the story that we tell about kind of our whole lives. If you think of your life as, an epic, and you're the, hero of that story, who you are, where you came from, and where you're going. That's another way that we tell stories. And that's another way we can either tell a story that holds ourselves back or one that moves us forward. So let me give an example. So one of the people who I interviewed for my book was, his name was A.P.E.X. And A.P.E.X., when I spoke to him, he was and still is living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And a couple years before I spoke to him, he had been a semi-professional football player in Tulsa, for a team in Tulsa. And one day on the field had a really profound injury that caused him to become paralyzed from the neck down. So, in the weeks and months after that injury, A.P.E.X. was telling a pretty negative story about his life, which, you can imagine if I were in that situation, I would have been too. He was saying things like, my life is over. I'm never going to be able to do the things I want to do. My parents are going to have to take care of me for the rest of my life. Who's going to want to marry me? This is awful. And so people who tell stories like that, what the psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern, who studied the stories people tell about themselves for decades, what he calls contamination stories, stories that move from good, my life was great, to bad, now my life stinks. They tend to be more anxious and depressed and to feel like their lives are less meaningful. And that was A.P.E.X. for a while. But with time, he started to tell a different story. And his new story went like this. He said, before my injury, I was a pretty selfish guy. I cared more about how I did on the team and my performance than about how the team was doing. I partied a lot. I didn't really, pay as much attention to the people who were helping me, like my parents and friends. And now I realize that I can be a better man and I have a chance to change the person that I am. And that simple edit to his story ended up changing his life. As he told this new story to himself, the story of, okay, my life isn't over, there's more for me in the future, he decided to go to college and to get a degree in counseling. And today he works in the public school system in Tulsa as a counselor for students there. So reframing his story not only brought a deeper sense of meaning to his life, but it actually helped him find purpose, which is something that we see happen a lot when people are, when they're leaning on one pillar, it often leads to a strengthening of another pillar. So that raises the question, how can we change our stories if we are telling one that's holding us back? And there are a lot of ways to do it. I mentioned therapy as one way. I know that you guys have a counseling center on campus. I highly encourage you to take advantage of it. But we can also do it on our own as well, just by reflecting on our lives in a deep way. What were the high points of our lives? What were the low points? How did we change? What did we lose? Acknowledging the loss, grieving it, but also, what did we gain? We won't change our stories overnight because oftentimes the experiences that most profoundly shape us, whether it's the pandemic, losing a loved one, having a terrible injury, they're really difficult experiences to process. But if we're patient with them and if we lean into them rather than trying to dismiss them and not think about them, we will, the research shows us, we will eventually come out to the other side with a greater sense of meaning in our lives. So belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling, the 4 pillars of meaning. We've all been going through a really difficult time over the last couple of years. And so by way of conclusion, I want to talk about an idea that I think that we don't hear enough about, which is post-traumatic growth. There's a lot out there about post-traumatic stress disorder, all the ways that adversity and trauma can undo us and make our lives fall apart. And PTSD is certainly a very serious issue, and a lot of people experience the symptoms of PTSD in the aftermath of adversity and trauma. But it turns out that only 2 to 3% of people experience the full-blown disorder after something hard happens, but that anywhere from half to 2/3 of people experience post-traumatic growth in the aftermath of adversity. And what happens is that people report growing in a number of ways. So they either say that their relationships have deepened, their spiritual life has deepened, they have found new purposes and possibilities for their lives, like Emeka. They discover new strengths in themselves that they didn't realize they had. And finally, they're more grateful for all the things that they had, that they were taking advantage of before. So, what we know from the research on post-traumatic growth, resilience, and meaning is that people who have a strong sense of meaning in life before an adversity are far more resilient as they move through it. So if you think of if a good metaphor is an earthquake, this is the metaphor that the post-traumatic growth researchers use. So if you have kind of, strong pillars, in your building before the earthquake, you're much more likely to withstand the turmoil of the earthquake as it's happening. But then afterwards, you rebuild, and you rebuild even stronger. And that's what post-traumatic growth is. And the mechanism, the way that people grow through trauma is by relying on these pillars, and in particular, the pillar of storytelling. So they pause and they think about, how did I grow as a result of what happened? What lessons can I learn? Grieving what was lost and giving it its due, because that's a really important part of it, is really appreciating that something profound has been lost, but also thinking about, okay, how is my life different? And in what ways are my resources, both personal and external to myself, stronger? So post-traumatic growth is something that I think can give us all hope as we move through the different experiences of our lives, whether it's individual trauma and adversity or collective ones. There's this myth out there that to lead a meaningful life, you have to do something extraordinary. You have to become an Instagram influencer, as they call it. You have to, start the next Facebook. You have to, be famous, end world hunger, something that's going to make it into the history books. But that's not what I found in my research and reporting. Meaning comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It comes from having a positive interaction and connection with the person who's selling you a newspaper or handing you a cup of coffee. It comes from, raising your kids or doing chores like cleaning up around the house or, a hospital room. It comes from looking up at the stars at night and feeling a sense of awe and wonder. It comes from reflecting on your life in an intentional way. Each of these things on their own might not sound like much, but when you bring them together, they can really light up your life. And that's the power of meaning. Happiness is wonderful, but it comes and goes. But meaning gives us something to hold on to, both when life is good and when life is bad. Thank you.
was such a very powerful, strong message that you delivered, and I think it's very, very timely as well.
Thank you.
So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. So I want to know a little bit more about the relationship between the four pillars. Is it that they are independent of each other, or do they interact reciprocally? Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and that also makes me think, you don't have to necessarily have all four pillars in your life in order for your life to be meaningful. For some people, the pillar of belonging is going to be much more important than the pillar of transcendence. Some people, transcendence is the thing. But the more pillars you have, kind of the more resilient your sources of meaning are, and that's in part because they do kind of feed off of each other. So you might if you have children, for example, I mentioned kids. That might give you a sense of belonging because there are those relationships, but it can also be a source of purpose in your life. And what that means too is that as you move through life, the pillars that you're relying upon for meaning might shift and change. So, when you're, in the middle of life, psychologists talk a lot about how people are enmeshed in all kinds of projects and communities. You're raising kids, you're taking care of your parents, you're involved in your community. And so there's a lot of belonging. But then as you get older, the kids leave, you retire, and your sources of purpose may start to dwindle because they're no longer part of your life. And so what do you do in those cases? And so leaning on the other pillars or having them as part of your life allows you to turn to them when one of them, is not as strong as it was. I think the story of A.P.E.X is another nice example of how one pillar can give rise to another. So for A.P.E.X, doing some sense making about his life, thinking about his story of his past, but also the story that he wanted to live, ultimately brought him to this place where he discovered his purpose, which was serving in his community.
Okay, that's wonderful. It kind of makes me think about the different dimensions of wellness and how you can use one dimension to help support others, maybe that are struggling and whatnot.
Yes.
And it sort of segues into my next question. I was thinking about this from a developmental perspective, and I was wondering, I guess intuitively, I kind of think that maybe the pillar of belonging might be first to develop as children age and grow and develop and whatnot. But is that the case? And if that is true, do the other pillars follow in a typical sequence, or are things less linear and less predictable than that?
No, I mean, it's such a great question. And I do think there's something to what you're saying. When you think of a young infant, the most important thing in a young infant's life is its caretakers, and having secure attachments to your caretakers is predictive of all of these things. And in part, what a secure attachment is defined as is an attachment where your parents are reliable, but they also kind of love you for who intrinsically. Their love is not contingent or conditioned, and so to me that's what belonging is. And so having that sense of belonging, relying on your family and your community, I think is something that does come first. And just from an evolutionary perspective, even having community and being part of the group was so vital to survival. In ancient times, if you wanted to be punished, banishment was considered worse than death, because if you were expelled from the community, that was like a form of dying, because you needed the community for your identity and for your survival. And so I think that's also why in the research people will say that belonging, for most people belonging is the most important source of meaning in their lives. So those bonds that we have to others.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we probably have time for one more quick question. Okay. I was in some ways surprised to hear about the role of storytelling and how that plays into the development of meaning and whatnot. And after hearing you elaborate more on it, it made sense to me. And from what you said, it sounds like storytelling is maybe a little bit more intentional than the other pillars, and that there sounds like there are ways therapists work to build storytelling and whatnot. Is there some intentionality to the other pillars as well? I know you talked a little bit about asking students about their purpose in life and everything, but and looking up at the trees. So are all these pillars in some sense intentional? And can we make them even more so?
I think they are. I think that there's like yes and no. So I think that there's a study that was done of adolescents, and it asked them, how meaningful is your life, and how many chores do you do around the house? And it turns out that the kids who do more chores rate their lives as more meaningful because the researchers think it's because they feel like they're contributing to the household. I think in that case, it's probably not intentional or obvious to the young people that's why they feel a greater sense of meaning in life. So I think there are a lot of ways that we're just kind of engaged in life, engaged in our projects and pursuits that make our lives feel meaningful, and it's not at the forefront of our minds. But I also think that a really important part of meaning is having this mindset of meaning where your eyes are kind of open to the sources of meaning that are all around you, knowing that, leaning into a connection can build meaning, not just for you, but for the other person. And I think storytelling is one of the more intentional ones, because when it's a lot of people, like I said in the talk, like they don't realize they have this ongoing narrative. And once you realize that you do, that's an act of intentionality. And then you can, be intentional about the kind of story you want to live and the kind of story that you're telling. So I do think that there is a sense in which we have to kind of actively pursue meaning and actively think about, what our purpose is. It doesn't always mean that we have to change what we're doing. You could be like, for example, you could be doing exactly what you're doing, but have never really thought about what your purpose is. But then thinking about it, think, okay, well, like, I value kindness. And so my purpose is to kind of be a kind person. And that kind of helps you kind of make sense of your life in a different way.
All right. Well, those are some wise words. And I now have an argument to get my kids to do more chores around the house.
Exactly.
So that's wonderful. I think we are out of time. I know we could talk for forever about this, but I want to remind you all that at 2:30, Emily will be back here for a Q&A, and there will be a book signing out in the hallway, so I hope you will join us. And thank you again for your time today and delivering such an important message to us all. Thank you.
Thank you all.